Some of us around here are old enough to remember sex ed class in middle school way back in the 1970s. Classes taught by teachers who clearly did not want to be teaching those classes. So they showed a lot of films, like this one.
These functions begin as we attain sexual maturity. But all of us do not mature at the same age. These differences and the fact that girls usually mature earlier than boys, both physically and emotionally, sometimes create problems. But by the time boys and girls reach their late teens, these problems will have been solved.
Yeah. You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more
to huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
That all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody is free until everybody's free.
The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
History matters because it's not just about the past. History's about us, here and now. It explains the world we live in and why things are the way they are. And history gives us insights into how to achieve a more just, peaceful, and prosperous future. So people, let's do this. Hi there, everyone. Welcome to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters. I'm host Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and this is In the Past Lane, episode 38. It's our annual Back to School episode. And this time around, we look at the history of two public school curriculum controversies, bilingual education and sex education. These two topics have a lot more in common than you might think. We are coming to you this week from the Horace Mann Studios, located on the campus of Holy Cross College in Worcester, Massachusetts. You can learn more about me, this podcast, and our guests at our website, inthepastlane.com. You can also follow me and this podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. The principal of this little red schoolhouse of a podcast is our executive producer, Lulu Spencer. Well, as I mentioned a few moments ago, since it's September and millions of students and teachers are heading back to school, it seemed like a good time to drop an episode of In the Past Lane that examines a topic related to the history of education. I've always been fascinated by the history of education. In fact, I wrote my master's thesis in grad school on a history of education topic. Now, I'll grant you that education history may not seem as exciting as, say, political or military history. But if you stop and think about it, Americans have been fighting over public schools from the moment we invented them way back in the 1830s. We've fought about the cost and curriculum, segregation and secularism, teachers and testing, you name it. That's in part because in the United States, we've always expected a lot from our public schools. We want our schools to do way more than just merely teach children the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. And schools are sites of rancor and discord because the challenges, controversies, and concerns over public education have always reflected the problems facing American society at large. Problems like poverty, inequality, racism, drugs, sex, guns, gangs, and violence. These sources of public education controversies will be quite evident in this episode. I'll speak with historian Natalia Petrzela, author of Classroom Wars, Language, Sex, and the Making of Modern Political Culture. This book focuses on the twin controversies over bilingual education and sex education in the 1960s and 1970s. But before we get to that conversation, I have two very exciting announcements. First, you may recall that a few weeks back, I mentioned that In the Past Lane was in the running for an award for the annual Podcast Awards. Well, I'm thrilled to announce that we are now in the finals. Thanks to all of you who went to podcastawards.com to vote for In the Past Lane. Now, I'm keeping my expectations in check, but it's an honor just to be in the company of some of these amazing podcasters. And I'll keep you posted on the results. And my second announcement is that my next episode will feature an interview with documentary filmmaker Ken Burns. He's been making documentaries for almost 40 years, and his latest looks like it might be his very best. An 18-hour documentary on the Vietnam War that begins airing on PBS on September 17th. I've seen large segments of this documentary, and it's extraordinary. I'll talk with Ken Burns about why he chose such a huge and controversial topic, and what he hopes Americans will learn from it. Okay, people, the wheels on the bus are about to go round and round. Your journey in the Past Lane begins now. Okay, with me now is Natalia Petrzela. Natalia is Associate Professor of History at the New School in New York City. Her writing has appeared in the Washington Post, Slate, and the Huffington Post. She's also co-host of a history podcast called Past Present, and she's also the author of a book, Classroom Wars, Language, Sex, and the Making of Modern Political Culture, published by Oxford University Press and now out in paperback. And that's what we've brought her to In the Past Lane for to talk about today. So, Natalia, welcome to In the Past Lane.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Well, it's timely that we get to talk to you in late August about a book about American education history because school's coming back into session, and there's never a time when people are not talking about education and educational policy. So the period your book focuses on is the 1960s and 1970s. So I guess I'll just start with a really broad question, which is why this period? What's going on in this period that makes it worthy of study? And also the two issues you take up are rather interesting because they, at first glance, they don't seem like they relate to each other. One is the controversies and questions about sex education, and the other is bilingual education. And they're essentially happening at the same time. And you've managed to point out that these aren't just random, this isn't just a coincidence that they're happening at the same time. They actually are intertwined in the larger political discussions going on in the area that you study, California. So could you tell us, why this period and how these two issues come together?
Well, no surprise to anyone paying attention, one of the most polarizing issues in this period, of course, was Black-white desegregation, right? We're like 10, 20 years out after Brown v. Board of Education, schools are still grappling with how to deal with the race problem. That was and continues to be fascinating to me. But I was also interested in the way that this language of diversity, which was everywhere during that period, what it meant for issues other than Black-white race relations. California ended up being a really good place to look at that because it's been so multi-ethnic, so multiracial. In this period, the Federal Immigration Act of 1965 meant there was this new influx of Spanish-speaking immigrants. And then this is also the era when the sexual revolution is taking shape. So I'm like, how do these ideals of integration and inclusion and equality apply when we're looking beyond the Black-white desegregation issues? So it's obviously a longer story than that, but those are some of the things that got me into this project, and most importantly, which kept me engaged for, the decade it takes to do that research and write that book.
It is important to choose something that you can really hang on to, given the ups and downs of, especially the first project is one that you really better pick the right one, and because it can take a long time and you have to really be wedded to it. So
totally.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating time period, and it has some people we've never heard of before, but also prominent figures, particularly prominent conservative figures like Ronald Reagan play a role in this story. Mm-hmm. So with sex ed, what are conservatives concerned about? What are they worried about as schools debate and discuss whether or not to incorporate sex education into their curriculum, and then also what shape that would take? What is it that they're worried about?
So the first thing to point out is that there had been sex education in quite a few American schools since the early 20th century. Usually the first one is said to be 1913 in the Chicago public schools. But that sex ed was quite properly undertaken by people who considered themselves advocates of a movement called social hygiene. So it was more about disease control. Right. It was even about a little bit about population control. Even though it did cause controversy in that era for raising questions about sexuality that many people thought were inappropriate to talk about with children, it was a pretty fundamentally conservative project in many places, not in all of them. But what happens in the early 1960s is that there is this impetus among many people who became moderate sex ed reformers or advocates, where they see culture changing around them. They see the Supreme Court narrow the definition of obscenity such that you have, bodice ripper novels with buxom women on the cover, billboards that had images on them that used to have to be behind brown paper bags. And so you have moderates who are saying hey, if we don't talk to kids about this stuff in schools, they are going to not really know how to deal with what's going on in the outside world, this kind of constant titillation around them. And what's interesting is that actually was in the early to mid 1960s a pretty radical proposition. So let's use taxpayer money to talk about sex with kids, even if the goal was very much, if you look at these curriculum, very much, let's talk about sex so that they can eventually get married. Let's talk about petting so that girls know when to make boys stop. I mean, it's pretty conservative messaging, but what conservatives are fired up about in a way that seems almost quaint today is at that point, there was still a sense that this is totally inappropriate to be talked about in school. This is something that, one, probably shouldn't even really be talked about with kids, but if it is, it's the realm of the parent or maybe the clergy to speak to children about it. And so conservatives really were equating sex education with sex instruction. That was a conflation they put forth all the time. If you talk to kids about sex, you're basically piquing their interest and teaching them to do it. And so you see conservatives making that argument a lot. So what they're advocating for is really silence.
Right. And there's that terrific image in the book, and you talk about this, the pamphlet, is the schoolhouse the proper place to teach raw sex?
Exactly.
And that was a huge, widely distributed pamphlet, and it sort of gets right to the nub of their concerns, that it's not what kind of sex ed, it's just that it exists at all.
Right.
And that seems to be their chief concern.
And nobody is teaching sexual technique. That's the important thing, right? But the title of that pamphlet, which was written by this Christian Crusade character, Gordon V. Drake, sold over 1 million copies. And you see from the title, is it the place to teach raw sex? It sounds like it's how-to classes, right? And so that really fired up a lot of people. So, what did people worry was going to happen, right? What did conservatives worry the impact was of this? Well, they worried that kids would, one, want to have sex earlier, and that wasn't going to be good. They worried specifically, actually, and remember, this was the Cold War, this was going to prime them for communist takeover. The kids would, learn to abandon their parents' moral guidance, which would eviscerate the American family, and they would just become these kind of rootless individuals enslaved to their own sexual pleasure. And that would prime them for communist takeover. And so really you see, I argue that it's through these debates in many ways about sex education that you see this grassroots articulation of the family values ideology, which became so prevalent in the 1980s. And I would say until Trump was really been such an important part of conservative politics.
Right, that notion that they removed God from the school and replaced it with sex. I think that was a kind of if not an actual bumper sticker, a slogan of conservatism when it came to this issue.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, as you point out, the people who were advocating sex ed in this period were aware of this concern about the erosion of the family and so forth. So as you point out, their version of sex ed is pretty tame. It's all about family. It's all about marriage and so forth. You could almost picture them saying, don't you guys get it? We're trying to do this the right way. We're pro-family, but it didn't seem to work.
Yeah, it did not seem to work very well. But that said, before when I wrote this book, or rather when I began researching this as a dissertation, people who'd written about this stuff before tended to arrive at the conclusion that this was kind of one series of battles in the forward march of the American right. Although I think there's some veracity to that argument. At the same time, by the 1970s, these sex ed conservatives are being ridiculed by a lot of people, right? So even though they did win a lot of battles and they got sex ed out of a lot of particular schools and caused some great personal damage to a lot of people in the process, you see kids, the next generation, some of whose parents were these anti-sex ed advocates, laughing at them, calling them, kind of doomsday moralists. And you see, and I think this is most important, that in the 70s, sex ed curricula in California, this place where there were more anti-sex ed organizations than anywhere else in the United States in the 60s, you see curricula becoming more adventurous. You see Planned Parenthood stepping in and offering curricula. You see, gay speakers coming to class. And really most of the fire inflaming that anti-communist rhetoric is basically gone in the 1970s. So I think that although, the rhetoric of family values has remained and been quite powerful, I mean, you could say that the preeminence of abstinence-only education signals their victory. I think that a lot of the norms of liberal sex educators actually were amplified in the coming years.
Yeah, it's sort of a quiet victory in a way.
Yeah.
That you could be deceived by the rhetoric and by the organizations, but that if you were to chart it on a graph, it certainly seems that more sex education was available to students with every year, and that it achieved many of the goals of the pro-sex ed initiative, the people that were backing it. Well, that's one piece of this story. And then running along the same historical track is this question of bilingual education, which, as we said at the beginning, may seem to be a very different thing, but it's not. And it's also a very California story.
Yeah.
In many ways, California is always at the forefront of these social movements and social questions. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. So bilingual education, Spanish bilingual education particularly, is what I focus on in the other half of the book. In 1965, the U.S. immigration policy was revised. The Hart-Celler Act ended up letting in a lot of Asian and Latino immigrants. Many of these coming in through the Southwest into California were Mexicans. That then initiates a very robust conversation among policymakers in California in particular about what they call the Mexican-American problem. The educational component of that problem, and you can't see me, but using air quotes around problem, of course, the educational implications of that are very, very low academic attainment. So a stat that gets thrown around all the time is that 50% of Mexican-American students drop out by the 8th grade. How are they going to fix that? Well, in a moment defined, by civil rights activism that everyone in the country is paying attention to in the South and in parts of the North and in the West as well, this is a time of rallying cries for ethnic recognition. What happens is that as opposed to the kind of sink or swim policies, which are often associated with much of the early 20th century, you have calls for linguistic recognition in public schools. This gets institutionalized in 1968 in the Federal Bilingual Education Act, but it's California really that's a very important laboratory for figuring that out. And so what you see until about 1968, so throughout the 60s, is a shocking consensus among people who become defined as hardcore right-wing Republicans. Not 5 years later, they're all kind of on board with what sound even today like very adventurous solutions to this issue. We should have a textbook exchange with Mexico. Anglo kids should learn Spanish as much as Latin kids should learn English. All of that is being discussed during the mid-1960s across the political spectrum in California. We don't know that story usually.
Right. And isn't it the person behind that particular initiative is Max Rafferty, who's the superintendent of California schools, and he's a very conservative individual. So to hear him talk about that is really quite amazing.
Yeah, he's someone I focused on a lot. He's a fascinating person. He got real national recognition in the 70s and even in the early 80s as a real dyed-in-the-wool conservative. He had syndicated columns. He wrote multiple books. He talked about, the 660s being the scourge of civilization, very grandiose rhetoric. He advised a bunch of Republican presidents and lawmakers. I mean, the list goes on. But what I was shocked was that early on in his tenure, even not that early, in the middle of his tenure as California superintendent of education, he's the one saying all those quotes I just mentioned about the importance of bicultural, bilingual education. He's the one who is advocating for conferences on Mexican-American education. He appoints Eugene Gonzalez, who becomes the highest-ranking Latino appointee in the California state bureaucracy. He appoints him. So I don't want to say his solutions were, kind of like super politically radical, but they were groundbreaking. And that there had not been much institutional attention to this issue. And it's really surprising that it was under the stewardship of a person who would become to known as a national conservative voice on school issues.
There's this consensus, at least on some level, about bilingual education and so forth. But then it does become controversial by the late 60s and certainly into the 70s and beyond. What causes that shift that it falls into more predictable liberal conservative camps?
Well, something that happens, which still kind of breaks my heart, and I don't even know whether to, how to give a value judgment on it, is that there becomes a much more radicalized Latino contingent who is advocating for not only bilingual education, but they're advocating for minority administrators in schools. They're advocating for a kind of political platform that corresponds to the radical agenda of La Raza, which is affiliated with the Black Power movement, or at least which draws inspiration from the Black Power movement. So in many ways, that connection, right? The fact that bilingual education advocates are connecting their struggles to third world liberation, to the anti-Vietnam War activism, that signals real growth for the movement, right? Like this is more voices speaking up, not just a bunch of, bureaucrats talking about it. But for a guy like Rafferty, that makes it a cause that a guy like him can no longer support. So what happens in 1968, and it's this turning point year, and there are these framing events that happen in the space of just several weeks, where on the first business day of the year, January 2nd, I believe it was, Lyndon Johnson signs into law the Bilingual Education Act. Okay, so that is putting federal teeth into enforcing the rights of linguistic minorities. That's unprecedented. That's making the rights of linguistic minorities part of the Great Society package. So that happens first. Not 6 weeks later, in March, you have walkouts of high school, college kids in East LA and in other places demanding better services. And there's actually the cover picture of my book has this one of these walkouts. The sign is "School, Not Prison." It really changes the tone of things.
Right. It seems to be very politicized. And if you're an observer, you're linking this to all the other radicalisms and radical outbreaks that have happened leading up to 68 and that are also percolating as well. In some ways, it's the wording and it's also the optics that is at play here.
Yeah, and I think it's very specific. If you think that conservatism in this period is defining itself against big government and against campus disorder, bilingual education, in part because it's gaining more power, becomes associated with both of those issues, which means that for right wing, certainly, but even for centrist conservatives, no way can they support an initiative like this. So it's really 68 where you start to see this real polarization. And one of the things that was so interesting to me was this guy Gonzalez, who Rafferty had appointed, who ends up dealing with a lot of the bilingual education fallout. He finds himself in the middle of kind of navigating all of this. And so he's going around to campuses, both kind of trying to say, oh, Mexican Americans are important, we're not going away, and kind of raising morale, but also telling these radicalizing student groups like, whoa, you don't need to hit the administration with a 2x4, like just calm down, right? So he is a really interesting figure who's caught in the middle of this. And I think also because of his ethnicity, gets called out in a variety of ways, which aren't entirely fair, but which are really fascinating lenses on the political conversation at the time.
So if we, move as we did with the sex ed question, if we move the ball forward into the 70s and into, towards the end of your book in the early 80s, what's the resolution or what's the status of the question of bilingual ed by the early 1980s? Do we see a similar way in which it's achieved a foothold and has become legitimized, at least in certain states and certain school districts?
Definitely in some places. And one of the arguments that I make is that it was never just about language. This was about cultural recognition and about pluralism. And that actually, yes, one of the results of all this activism is that there is at least a rhetorical commitment to kind of multicultural recognition in schools. Bilingual education, which I'll say it again, was never just about language, is responsible for helping to institutionalize a kind of celebration of ethnicity and foreign language that did not exist before. I think one telling example is that in the early 1960s, even the mid-1960s, you had Latinos who were protesting to get 911 operators to speak Spanish. That seems like a pretty basic ask, and it was not met. It was seen as a total incursion on kind of American identity. By the 1990s, you have got bilingual Spanish-English bilingual schools in San Francisco where upper middle class families are lining up to sign their white kids up to learn Spanish along with English and often to learn alongside Central American and Mexican kids. I don't think that's insignificant. At the same time, all of that consensus, if you could call it that, loose consensus that I mentioned of the mid-60s is pretty much gone by then. And you can see this in the examples of particular people. I mean, Eugene Gonzalez, who I think was quite conflicted during the 60s and the 70s, but certainly an advocate for greater recognition for Latino ethnicity and culture and Spanish language. He's advocating English-only initiatives by the 1990s. And you actually have this passionate English-only movement, which gets support, predictably, from white conservatives who are crying cultural takeover about Latinos and about Spanish in schools. But it actually also gets some buy-in from some Latinos, particularly second generation and third generation people who say, hey, you know what's racist? Racist is the assumption that I need to learn from someone who looks like me or who speaks like me. There's no reason that I can't learn from a blonde-haired, blue-eyed teacher like your ancestors did. And so although that's not the majority of people, I think that there is a real resistance to Spanish bilingual education in particular that takes shape in the 1980s. And I should say the sources of that are varied. There are certainly white racists who are seeing this as another part of the kind of cultural adulteration of America, the decline of Western civilization and American values, et cetera. But, you know, there's also some philosophical inconsistency among bilingual education advocates, one of which is, what is bilingual education? When I was in the archive, you know, there was good faith confusion among the people making these policies. You know, does ESL, that's English as a second language, is ESL curriculum, is that bilingual ed? Is it immersion? You know, not really knowing even what they were legislating, really. And the truth of the matter is, all those programs, I would say that bilingual ed falls into is about 3 camps, but all of those pedagogies have different merits, different problems, very different cost structures. And so there were some internal issues as well, contributed to giving grist to people who were very anti-bilingual ed, often on grounds of culture or race.
So even though there's some interesting developments in this 20-plus year period that you talk about, and your book essentially ends in the early 1980s,
yeah, the
controversies and the questions continue to rage on and take different form. So thinking about the years that follow the story that you cover, and I always ask people, you know, what makes your work, besides interesting and fascinating, what makes it relevant for today? And certainly public school questions are very relevant. It seems to me that, you know, the questions about public schooling, literally fundamental questions, are quite different, or the fundamental assumptions are quite different from the 80s to now. Do you have a sense of where we are in terms of literally the status of public education, let alone sex ed and bilingual ed?
Yes, definitely. I think some of your inclinations are right. I think we are in a different place in terms of one fundamental assumption, which I saw eroding throughout the era that I study, which is that as bitter as these classroom wars were, they all have this bedrock assumption that public schools are worth fighting for, right? They have very different ideas of what public schools should look like, but they all think that their people, however you define that, have a right and an interest and a stake in defining what goes on in public schools. That really is coming apart by certainly the early 1980s. In California, the tax revolt of 1978, I think, is a big part of that. That's Proposition 13, which inspired other property tax revolts throughout the country. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that education was a material reason for people wanting to pull back on funding curricula that they thought were fundamentally misguided. And so what you see after this period passes is both, I think, among many people on the left, a kind of cynicism about public schools, right? That instead of declaring schools should not be prison, you start hearing later talk about the school to prison pipeline, a kind of disaffection with schools as another American institution that lets down marginalized people. And then among conservatives, they also feel like schools have let them down. That's why you see the rise of homeschooling, and you see other tax incentives to go to religious schools during the ensuing years, and vouchers and later charters, and all these market-based solutions, interestingly, mark a kind of new consensus where you have lots of people, marginalized people, conservative people, people of means, believing that the solution to public schools is to give as many people the opportunity to get out of traditional public schools as possible, right? And that certainly has not looked perfect, and there are a lot of critics, these private solutions. But I would say that that is a major, major shift that has happened in the intervening years since my narrative closes and today.
Right. So plenty more fodder for classroom wars.
Oh, yeah.
Looking forward. Well, this has been great, and your book is really fascinating and
Thank you.
Really captures an important part of really relatively recent history. But I also want to, before we go, I want to ask you about the podcast. You're a part of the Past Present team, and you guys are on the verge of a 100th episode, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And you're teamed up with Nicole Hemmer and with Neil Young, two other historians. So how has that been? I mean, you've done a lot of writing for the public and the Washington Post, and you in many ways are a public intellectual. But this is a different format. How's it going? And what are your impressions now, 100 episodes on?
I love it. I really have nothing but positive things to say about it. I'll say that so Neil and Nikki really came up with the idea for the podcast, and they invited me to be a part of it. Now almost about 2 years ago, I guess they invited me. And my thought was that, okay, do I really want to say yes to another big commitment? But the thing that made me say yes is one, I love Neil and Nikki, and I already loved them then. And I was already passionate about writing for the public and being in the public. But here's the thing, I know myself, I couldn't take on another writing role. Like if someone had offered me a column, I would have loved to get that offer, but there's no way I could have or could take that on. The podcast to me is so fun because it uses a different part of my brain and it's a different form of self-expression that allows me to engage and to learn about and read about and research and talk and share about issues of the day I feel very passionate about, but that I do not have time to write a full op-ed or an article about. And so it's very cathartic in that way. And then it's also, I'd say the other part, and two, again, it's just really fun. Like I love reading about all these different issues and discussing them with Neil and Nikki. And then it's so gratifying. I mean, as you know too, the scale of reach of digital media is so potentially enormous that I hope that podcasts will never replace, sitting in the seminar room, but it's kind of intoxicating to think how many people we can be in touch with like this. I mean, we found out recently that I think last month we had over 50,000 unique downloads. And so that's really gratifying because I believe we're putting good content out there. And so it's exciting to think that 50,000 people last month were enthused about historical analysis. So I feel like we're doing something good and that has effects beyond just the scholarly audience of our scholarly writing and even beyond the audience of much of the public writing that we do.
That's great. Well, I think the dynamism that the three of you have and the way you play off of each other really makes for a great product.
Thank you.
One that everybody across the fruited plain expects then Tuesday morning. I know you guys had a technical glitch, I think it was last week, and when something doesn't drop on schedule, people get very antsy. So
I know, it's so stressful. But it was also flattering. I'm like, oh, all these people.
Yeah, I want my past present. That's great.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But then we fixed it, thank God.
Well, good luck with everything. Thank you so much for talking to us at In the Past Lane. And at some point down the road, I've had Nikki on earlier, and I'll get the past-present trifecta if I have a chance to speak with Neil about his work.
Hat trick. I love it. It's awesome. We appreciate it. And thanks for all the great work that you do. We history podcasters have to stick together.
That's right. Okay. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Natalia Petrzela is Associate Professor of History at the New School in New York City. She is the author of Classroom Wars, Language, Sex, and the Making of Modern Political Culture, published by Oxford University Press and now out in paperback. And I highly recommend that you check out the podcast Natalia co-hosts. It's called Past Present, and you can find it at iTunes, Stitcher, and all the other podcast platforms.
If you are enjoying this podcast, then please subscribe to In the Past Lane at iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you access your podcasts. Subscribing is free, and once you do it, new episodes of In the Past Lane are automatically downloaded to your listening device. Subscribing also gives you access to the entire back catalog of In the Past Lane episodes. And if you do subscribe, please leave a review. Thanks.
Well, people, as always, this has been a lot of fun. I want to thank you for listening, and I encourage you to weigh in with comments, questions, and suggestions via social media and at our website, inthepastlane.com. At this site, you'll also find a show page for this episode that includes links, essays, images, and further reading suggestions related to all the things we've talked about in this episode. In the Past Lane has been made possible by the hard work and dedication of many people. They include podcasting consultant Daryl Darnell of Pro Podcast Solutions, graphic designer Maggie Salucci, legal services by Tippa Canoe and Tyler Tu, and of course, 1,000 thank yous to our executive producer, Lulu Spencer. Special thanks also to Jay Graham for creating the intro music for this podcast, and to the Free Music Archive for providing the rest of the music for this episode. I'm In the Past Lane's host, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, reminding you that history explains our world, so let's pay attention to it. Thank you for listening. We hope you'll join us next time for another journey in the Past Lane. Hey, Lulu, I just had a brilliant idea.
Shit, not again.
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.